Today we're going to plant some potatoes directly in the ground for the very first time. That's right, I said it for my very first time. Most of y'all already know I've been pretty spoiled when it comes to growing potatoes because I've always done them in containers. And when you do them in containers, you are literally just growing them, dumping them out, and then harvesting and finding them all in one location. And when you're growing them in the ground, you actually have to dig and do a little bit more extra work when it comes to growing them. Now, the number one question I get asked about growing potatoes is really, when do you start growing them? And it's really as simple as checking your latest or last frost date. So here in North Carolina where we are, it's about the last week in February when you can plant your potatoes directly in the ground. But if you want to get a jump and a head start on growing potatoes, you actually can start them a lot sooner if you keep them covered in a container. So if you're doing container gardening, you can actually start your containers a lot sooner when it comes to growing potatoes, as long as you cover them up on those frost nights when you know those leaves are going to get hit. And you can also grow potatoes indoors. There are some people that grow them in basements, in garages. So don't just think you have to start whenever I say to start. Just know that if you're going to grow them in the ground, you need to wait at least 2 weeks before your last frost date. So when it comes to growing potatoes directly in the ground, it is a lot more work than just growing things in a container. I've actually sat here and tilled up most of this ground for about an hour to 2 hours, trying to get it all nice and prepped so I can plant my potatoes. And part of tilling up and getting your land ready to plant you some potatoes, you need to make sure you get all the clumps of grass out of there. All those big old balls of root systems, go ahead and dig those up. Make sure you toss them out of the way. Get them out of the way, because if you don't, those things are just going to try to root again. And then you'll have more grass growing in between your plants. And you're trying to avoid all the extra headaches you're going to have in the future, which is again why I love growing potatoes in a container, because you really don't have to worry about grass. You got everything contained inside one little specific area in order to grow your potatoes. But I owe it to y'all to show you start to finish how things work and grow in the ground as well. So first of all, let me start by saying that I started planting all of my potatoes with the vision as if I was planting them already in a container. So essentially, I planted these about every 5 to 6 inches apart. It doesn't really matter. You're just trying to replicate the exact way I plant these things in containers. And with all that said, if you haven't noticed, we did plant all our potatoes with the sprouts facing up. And probably the only thing I questioned myself with was how far down did I need to press these potatoes directly into the soil. So I really just pressed them down firmly into the soil to make sure they wouldn't even shake or move around after the fact I've got them planted. That way, when I go to cover these things, they don't have a chance of moving. So part of planting the potatoes directly into the ground was making sure that you tilled up the entire area that you wanted to plant your potatoes. That part was actually essential because you do need to make sure that the soil is completely soft around your potatoes. That way you can easily heal your potatoes and get these things covered up. And part of planting your potato seeds for the very first time is making sure that you have the entire seed covered. No matter how long the stems are or the sprouts are, make sure those things are covered up, because that's what I do every single time. Now, this is when I'll tell you that there's a lot of gardeners out there that will really just try to plant potatoes directly on top of the ground that they've tilled up and cover it with straw, and they have a great success growing potatoes this way. But for this experiment, I'm actually just using exactly what I have directly right in front of me, which is the ground. No other things added other than just my little bit of effort. So saying all of that, this is the very first step when it comes to growing potatoes. You have to get them planted, but there's a lot more left. So even though you're just seeing the beginning, I want you to know that there's tons of more days left between now and the time you harvest. You need to harvest these things in about 120 days. And between now and the next 120 days, you'll need to make sure you till up directly beside each of your rows of potatoes. That way you can continue to make a larger mound for your potatoes to grow, and that method is called hilling. Just consider the way I grew my potatoes in a container. I covered up the leaves every so often, and that's essentially what you're going to need to do again, but you're using the soil that you've tilled up around it to help build up that mound. And if you stuck around to the very end, just remember that I'll show you the entire process from start to finish again. All you need to do is make sure you're subscribed. That way you know when I'm dropping my next video. And remember, everything you see on my videos, we can ship straight to your door.